There is a strange feeling that almost anyone who digs deeply into history eventually encounters. The more one reads, the more ancient artifacts one examines, the more it seems that some things simply refuse to stay within their proper time, as if someone misplaced them, as if Earth has lived through more phases than we have been told, and a few stubborn fragments of memory have somehow survived. Most of those fragments do not appear in textbooks. They lie at the bottom of the sea, inside tombs, or forgotten in the corners of museums, labeled with vague tags like ritual object or decorative item. People walk past them every day, but rarely stop to ask a simple question. What was this made for, and who was capable of making it? One of the strangest stories begins on the floor of the Mediterranean Sea more than a century ago. In 1901, a group of Greek sponge divers was forced to take shelter from a storm near a small island. When they descended into the water, they did not find coral reefs or large fish, but the broken remains of an ancient ship resting on the seabed. Among the wreckage were many familiar things: stone statues, bronze objects, ancient coins. But there was one object that almost no one paid attention to at first. A corroded, crumbling lump of metal that looked no different from ordinary marine debris. It was only after the object was brought back to Athens and carefully cleaned piece by piece that the situation began to feel unsettling. Inside the corroded mass was not jewelry or a weapon. It was a system of gears, many gears, small, evenly cut, meshing together with a level of precision that made it difficult to imagine they could have been crafted by hand. This was not a toy, nor did it resemble a ritual object. It functioned like a real machine. When researchers reconstructed its motion, they discovered that it could track the cycles of the sun, the moon, and the planets, even predicting long-term astronomical events. It was like a mechanical brain, hidden beneath the sea for more than 2,000 years. What unsettled researchers was not the fact that ancient people understood astronomy. What troubled them was how the device was made. Components this small require extremely high precision. A slight error would render the entire system useless. Yet here, everything worked smoothly, as if the maker was already thoroughly familiar with this kind of technology. When modern scanning equipment was used to look deeper inside, researchers also discovered tiny engraved inscriptions. Not prayers, not decoration. They looked like notes, like instructions, as if someone had written them so that others would know how to use the device. And it was this detail that led many to consider another possibility, that this object might not have been unique, but rather part of a much larger body of knowledge. Leaving the sea behind, the story shifts to Egypt, deep into the ancient necropolis of Saqqara. In 1936, when a royal tomb was opened, archaeologists found an object that no one knew how to categorize. It did not resemble a ceramic vessel. It was not an offering plate. It was a stone object shaped in a way that felt far too modern for its time. The disc was thin and symmetrical, and with 3 evenly curved blades and a central hole for a shaft. At a glance, it looked more like a machine component than a funerary object. The problem was the material. The stone was extremely fragile. A relatively small impact would cause it to crack, and yet it had been shaped cleanly and sharply, with no signs of crude correction or repair. If it was merely a ritual object, why make it so complex? And if it was a technical component, what machine did it belong to? No clear answer exists. The safest solution was to assign it a neutral label and place it behind glass. But the uncomfortable questions did not end there. In China, on Mount Baigong, researchers discovered a series of metal pipes embedded deep into the rock, extending down toward a saltwater lake. They were not randomly scattered. They had orientation, varying depths, and on different diameters, as if they had been deliberately placed. Analysis suggested that the pipes had been there for an extremely long time, longer than the known history of human civilization. And the more the site was examined as a whole, the more the mountain began to resemble a constructed installation rather than a natural formation. Pipes, water, stone structures, together they formed an image that made people uneasy to contemplate. To this day, no one dares to state with certainty what the site was used for. But one thing is clear: it does not look like something created by chance. And when too many coincidences appear across the world, people begin to wonder whether they have been viewing history from too narrow a distance. One interesting thing is that the most controversial objects are often not found in remote places or buried deep underground. Many of them are right in front of us, sitting behind polished glass cases under museum lights. People walk past, take photos, nod, and move on, without noticing that some of these objects refuse to obey history. In South America, particularly in Colombia, there are small gold objects that fit neatly in the palm of a hand. They are usually presented as jewelry, ritual offerings, or symbolic animal figures. On the surface, that sounds reasonable, but there is one detail that has begun to bother many observers. Their shapes are too precise, too balanced, too much like something designed for a specific function. These objects have elongated bodies, pointed noses, swept-back wings, and a vertical tail at the rear. If you knew nothing about history and saw only their shapes, you might assume they were models of some kind of flying object. And in fact, some people have thought exactly that. Not archaeologists, but engineers and pilots. When engineers reconstructed these shapes at accurate scale, what happened made many people fall silent. They flew. They did not wobble or tumble. They did not fall freely. They glided smoothly through the air, as if the design had already been refined. The feeling at that moment was not amazement, but discomfort, because no one knows where ancient people could have obtained such a form. This realization led many to re-examine the enormous markings on the ground in Peru with a different mindset. Long, unnatural lines. Figures that can only be fully seen from above. Not because we enjoy speculation, but because it is genuinely difficult to explain why someone would go to such effort to create things they could never fully observe themselves. Then the narrative abruptly shifts to North America, not to a museum, not to a temple, but to an ordinary family walk in Texas in the 1930s. They picked up an unusual rock with something protruding from it. When the stone was split open, what lay inside was an iron hammer with a wooden handle that had hardened over time. The hammer itself looked strangely familiar. The stone surrounding it did not. Geologists stated that this type of rock would have taken an extremely long time to form, so long that humans, at that point, should not have existed. The feeling here was not one of a great discovery, but of a mismatch, as if two objects from entirely different eras had been forced into the same place. The closer the hammer was examined, the more unsettling it became. The metal showed almost no corrosion. It did not resemble typical ancient iron. It did not resemble modern steel. It sat in between, refusing to belong to either side. And that is precisely why many chose silence. Because sometimes offering no explanation is easier than accepting an answer that would destabilize the entire framework. But some things cannot be ignored, simply because they are too large. In Africa, at a uranium mine in Gabon, something unusual was discovered during mining operations. The composition of the fuel there was unlike that of other deposits, as if it had already been used. Not by modern humans, but at a time so distant it is difficult to imagine. Further analysis revealed that a nuclear reaction had once taken place there, steadily, over a long period of time. What unsettled researchers was not the reaction itself, but how it ended. The waste had not dispersed randomly. Everything had been contained neatly, as if someone had anticipated the consequences. The problem is that at that time, Earth had no cities, no complex animals, no humans, at least according to what we believe. So who needed that kind of energy? And for what purpose, on a planet that was nearly empty? When these stories are linked together, the prevailing feeling is not panic, but doubt. Doubt that the history we are familiar with may be only a very thin slice. There may have been periods of development that rose and disappeared, leaving behind too few traces to form a complete narrative. And perhaps what we are finding today is not evidence of ancient glory, but fragments left behind after a great erasure, like the last marks clinging to the surface, just enough to make those who come later stop and ask, what happened here? If the earlier stories only left you feeling confused, these final pieces carry a far heavier weight. Not because they are stranger, but because they sit uncomfortably close to everyday human life. So close that you could simply turn away and pretend you never saw them. In 1936, inside a storage archive in Iraq, an archaeologist casually picked up a small clay jar sealed with bitumen. It looked like hundreds of other jars. No elaborate decoration, no special markings. But when it was opened, it did not contain ashes or ancient scrolls. Inside was a copper cylinder, and within that cylinder, an iron rod, positioned so that the two metals did not touch. It was only when a mildly acidic liquid was poured inside that something unexpected happened. A weak electrical current appeared. Not strong enough to impress a modern observer, but strong enough to raise a deeply uncomfortable question. Why does this structure function exactly like a battery? And more importantly, what was it made for? The safest explanation is to call it a ritual object. But that explanation does not account for the corrosion marks inside. Nor does it explain why the metals were assembled in such a technically correct arrangement. It feels as if someone once knew exactly what they were doing, but that knowledge was never passed on. Looking to Egypt, at the Temple of Dendera, there are carved reliefs that have fueled debate for decades. They resemble enormous glowing objects held carefully in the hands of the gods. Some say they are merely symbolic, others say they are imagination. But when placed alongside the jars from Iraq, they become much harder to dismiss. The story then takes us to South Africa, where miners have repeatedly uncovered small metallic spheres, so perfectly round that they show almost no deviation. Some of them bear parallel grooves running around their circumference, so regular that they do not resemble random formations. They are embedded in rock so ancient that humans, if they existed at all, left no other trace behind. What unsettles people is not the shape of these spheres, but their balance. When placed inside glass display cases, some of them rotate very slowly, almost without a stopping point. Not because they contain any mechanism, but because they are balanced with extreme precision, an unnecessary perfection, if this were merely a natural curiosity. When all of these fragments are assembled, the feeling is not that of reading about a glorious ancient civilization. It feels more like encountering objects left behind after a major catastrophe. There is no story preserved, no survivors to explain, only scattered artifacts, each in a different place, just enough to confirm that someone was once here, doing things we still do not understand. Perhaps there were times when Earth was far less peaceful than we imagine. Perhaps intelligent life emerged and vanished, not because it lacked capability, but because of the very technologies it created. And perhaps the most frightening thought is not how far they advanced, but how easily they disappeared. Looking at the present, humanity is accumulating technology at a staggering pace. Stronger sources of energy, more precise tools, an ever-growing ability to affect the planet itself. And like those who may have come before us, we believe we are in control. But if history is not truly a straight line, then the question we should be asking is not who was here before, but what caused them to no longer be here. Because that question, sooner or later, will come back to us. Perhaps far in the future, when everything has settled, someone will unearth a few pieces of metal, a few unfamiliar structures, and try to assemble them into a story. And just like us today, they will stand before the same sense of confusion, wondering whether they are looking at the ruins of an old world or a belated warning forgotten in the flow of time.